Does the name Joseph Burg mean anything to you?
He was national mafdal.
Now, it's known that people working for the Bible Society are believers in Yeshua. Yeah. My great uncle, my grandfather's younger brother, had married a lady from the Slonim family.
From Hebron originally.
Hebron. Dr. Burg's wife Rivka was a Slonim. Yeah.
Your grandfather?
No.
Your
Dr. Burg's wife.
Oh,
was a Slonim.
Oh, okay, I see.
So,
yeah.
I'm standing at the Bible Society stand during the book fair in '81. And Bull comes sauntering by. And he picks up a modern Hebrew version of the New Testament, starts leafing through it. And with my Israeli chutzpah, I said, אדוני השר, לא מפריע לך לקרוא בברית החדשה? ידידי הצעיר, אני יכול לצטט לך את הדרשה על ההר בעל פה. מה שמך? I said, Chaikin. משפחה.
Wow. That's a great story.
So I have the great privilege today of sharing moments of a conversation Gary and I had with Dov Chaikin a few days ago. But you'll have to forgive me because for those of you who don't know him, even an introduction is a near impossible task. Impossible because having been born in 1926, Dov has seen and experienced enough to fill at least 3 lifetimes. He grew up in Jerusalem during the British Mandate, lived through the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 through 1939. When he was 16, Dov falsified his age so that he could volunteer to serve in the British military during World War II. He has lived through all of Israel's wars. During Israel's War of Independence, Dov was serving at the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus and was an eyewitness to the horrific convoy massacre of the 1978 medical staff, patients, and workers, some of whom were his colleagues and friends. Dov has written an autobiography, and it's a fascinating read, of course. Its only shortcoming is that it's too short, but maybe he knew that in this century everyone has ADD, and therefore perhaps it's the perfect length. I can't recommend it more. In his book, Dov also recounts the equally arresting story of his religious upbringing and the evolution of that journey from a prominent ultra-Orthodox Jewish household to the secular world and eventually to a place called the Narkis St congregation. But now here's something I've learned from Dov. That journey has been anything but linear and is much more like concentric circles that continue to overlap and interplay. You see, in many ways, Dov never left his ultra-Orthodox home. And even at the times when perhaps to some it seemed he'd strayed the farthest, he'd find he'd actually come back full circle, right to where he'd started, to where it all started. Now, what I want to do for you is share some of those moments that best capture Dov's impassioned reasoning that allowed him to traverse those treacherous borders between these worlds. Because make no mistake, these borders are treacherous, and to cross them is, more often than not, indeed considered traitorous. But within those worlds, one sometimes finds great thinkers, provocateurs, who radically challenge the prevailing systems while gently and mercifully exhibiting tolerance and openness towards those who challenge their own ways and ideas. Dov found such people in his own family, most notably his grandfather, in whose home he was raised after Dov's father died when he was a young child. There are many stories of his grandfather's famous generosity and leniency in religious matters, but the story Dov tells of his grandfather's connection to the famous Rabbi Kook perhaps illustrates best the enormous influence that these unconventional figures had on his life.
I wanted to show you of another person who's not a member of the family. Yeah. You know that picture?
Wow.
Have you heard mention of him?
Rabbi Cook?
Yeah.
Sure.
I was commentary.
He was a giant of faith.
Yeah.
His biography is entitled Ha'ish Neged Azerem.
Mm.
You can say that Yeshua was also Ha'ish Neged Azerem. And I'll tell you a bit about him first. He arrived in the country in 1904. That's the year that Herzl died. And he eulogized Herzl. And that caused a terrible furor amongst the ultra-Orthodox.
Mm.
Because Herzl was a mitbolel.
Mm-hmm. Assimilationist.
Yes. And he was chief rabbi of Jaffa before World War One. He used to visit sometimes kibbutzim and moshavim in the north. It was more than a day's journey. And those secular chalutzim always received him with great respect. And once one of his followers asked him, "Ma lecha v'lamashunadim ha'ele?" And his response, when the temple stood in place, there was only one man, the high priest, who dared to enter the Holy of Holies on only one day of the year, on Yom Kippur. But when the temple was being built, hundreds of laborers passed that spot every day.
Mm.
That was his answer.
Mm.
Anyway,
Interesting. How do you? That's a very interesting answer. How do you interpret that answer?
he saw in those pioneers a sense of religion or faith which was very pronounced.
Mm.
Because he was a Zionist,
Mm-hmm.
unlike many others. In 1914, he went to Berlin to attend a conference of Agudat Israel, and he got stuck there because of the war. Went to stay with friends or acquaintances in St. Gallen in Switzerland. Now, my grandfather had the wine business in London. He had a wine cellar here in Petah and a business in London. And my grandfather brought over his brother-in-law, my grandmother's brother, to be a partner in the business. And it was an interesting mix. Mitnaged and a Chassid, a perfect relations. And my grandfather supported the that synagogue, which was also the Mitnagdim. And some, I have to tell a bit. The rabbi of the synagogue, who came over from Helsinki, had died in 1912, so there was no rabbi. And when my grandfather and his brother-in-law heard that Rabbi Kopp was in Switzerland, they wrote and asked him whether he would prepare to come and serve pro tem as rabbi of that synagogue. And he came, and for nearly 3 years that he was in London, he was hosted by my grandfather, who also hosted Rabbi Herzog when he was studying in London. That's the reason why he is in the book.
Mm.
And my grandfather, very much a follower of Haish Neged Azel.
Now, it would be difficult to overstate just how countercurrent Rabbi Kook's willingness was to work together with secular Jews, those Meshumadim, apostates, or literally translated, the destroyed ones. He was absolutely excoriated among mainstream ultra-Orthodox and came the closest there is to being excommunicated, one prominent rabbi at the time even ruling that his books should be burnt. Dov's grandfather wasn't merely hosting a prominent rabbi in London those several years. He was playing host to revolutionary ideas, harboring a willingness to challenge the status quo. That was the kind of man in whose home I grew up, Dov says of his grandfather. And I contend that the seeds were sown there already. But he needed to be met halfway. But again, halfway is the wrong way to describe it. As if there was a road that takes one away, and as if there's a measurable half that one needs to give up or compromise. Because again, Dov would contend he never left anywhere, and he has fully maintained his identity. But it certainly required that special willingness to reconsider your own truths, to change your mind, to stand defiantly in the face of the majority. And amazingly, Dov met someone with that same dogged commitment to the truth, conventions be damned. Someone with the same love for God and others that truly changed their lives. Someone like himself, whose countercurrent drive took him to the brink of excommunication.
When I first started attending, the healer was used to bring me back to Narkis St. And nobody tried to preach to me. In fact, when I first met her, she tried to say her faith, and I said to her, stop those Christian phrases. But she realized she had to tackle it differently. First of all, from the Tanakh. And when I first started attending, I was impressed by this tall American reading the Tanakh in such beautiful Hebrew. You know who I mean?
Is that Hal Varanen?
No.
David.
David Bivin. Sure.
David Bivin.
Yeah. Sure.
And we became very close friends, by the way.
Hmm.
I remember years ago, I said to him, David, I envy your scholastic achievement in Hebrew. And he shot back at me. I envy your innate feel for the language. And we still maintain contact with him every now and again phone each other.
Hmm.
But as I said, it could only have happened there because of the one person. He was not a knight in shining armor. But he was one of those very rare human beings. One of his greatest ambitions in life was to help the Jew find his Jewish Messiah as a Jew. Not turn him into a Christian. And he never preached to me. But once, early 1977, I said to him, Bob, I still have questions. So he said to me, you know what, I'm going up to Korea to mow the grass there. Why don't you come along with me? And he had me at his mercy for 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
We prayed together, studied a bit, and that was it. He wasn't without fault, I can't say. But sometimes I tell people that having grown up in my grandfather's home, who was in his own way a heretic, and having come under the influence of another heretic, Bob Lindsay, not surprising that I'm a heretic myself. In certain ways I am. I'm not very quote-unquote good Christian. I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm talking about myself and my granddaughter who follows the same route. Let me put it this way. First of all, like now, there was an hour of Bible teaching before the service. And Wes was then teaching, Wes Brown, teaching from the Tanakh. He knew that I knew Hebrew. And he kept asking me, is this correctly translated? This is what the Lord used, not only preaching, but to start to reread the Tanakh, which I had read from about age of 5 already. I had 2 older brothers, and I was jealous, so I started reading early. So I kept coming across very familiar passages and seeing them in a different light. So that's, and one, aside from the Saturday morning service, Sunday evening was Bob's workshop. That's when he really got to grips with things. Praying for people. And one Sunday in April of 77, I was sitting there together with Hila. I suddenly found myself on my feet and announced that I had no option but to accept Yeshua as Messiah, Savior, and Lord. And I asked for baptism then. but I stipulated the date,
Hmm.
the 23rd of May, 77. It was Shabbat.
Mm.
And Bob was going to have me baptized at the baptismal site in Karen, one of the churches there. But certain members of this membership said that's not good enough. So I was baptized at where the Yavdanit is, together with 4 others. And
You wanted to be baptized in Karen?
I didn't want to. He wanted to.
Oh.
Some members of the fellowship were that not good enough for him. So I was baptized there. There wasn't a Yavdanit there.
Uh-huh. It was just a muddy bank.
And there was not being dipped into the water, but Wes Brown stood in the water to help people, not to dip, but to help people up.
Mm.
You know, Bob came to the conclusion that the best form was like a mikveh,
Mm-hmm.
based on the story about Naaman, the Syrian general.
Mm-hmm.
You remember the story?
Yep.
Where Elisha told him to go and dip himself 7 times in the
Yeah.
Jordan. And the word in the Septuagint is the same as in the New Testament, but so that basis, Paul felt that that was the best form of baptism.
Mm.
So I was baptized. In that sense, I baptized myself. And confession of faith in front of people. So, as I said, it wasn't because of anybody preaching to me. I think they all realized that if they tried, it wouldn't work.
You notice Dov gives a little explanation about baptism and why it is critical for him to re-examine the traditional practice and seek to understand it in its original context. This is the kind of thing that is heretical for many Christians. We can scoff at ultra-Orthodox Jews disputing this or that tradition, but when it comes to our core doctrines, we can sometimes be no less fanatical or intolerant or unwilling to see the truth in a new light. Providentially, Dov found a kindred spirit, open and inquisitive, who, he said, walked with him on his road to Emmaus. Dov writes in his book how Bob Lindsay was declared a heretic after he died. Pity there aren't more such heretics in the church, Dov wrote. Dov sat with me and Gary for several hours, poring over various biblical passages and the rationale behind his beliefs. He also gives a great exposition on some of these same passages in a sermon he delivered at Narkis a few years ago. We put the link to that sermon in the bottom of the comments below, and I really recommend you have a listen if you want to hear a really great teaching. But I'll just leave you with one last vignette of him describing how and what he believes. That is quintessential Dov. It's great because he's lovingly cantankerous, teachable, original, and enlightening.
At the college, I don't know what they teach them. I think maybe there should be more emphasis on the Tanakh. I don't know. You too are Christians to the manner born. You also happen to be believers in Yeshua. You're not just Christians in name only. No. I don't call myself a Messianic Jew. And I remember years ago, really many years ago, on a ministry tour in Germany, I introduced myself to an 80-year-old gentleman as a Messianic Jew from Jerusalem. And he looked at me in astonishment. What do you mean, Messianic Jew? Jew, by definition, is Messianic, which is very true. So I'm a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. Or if you like it, I believe in the God of Israel in whatever form he chooses to manifest himself in Scripture.